Welcome to another video, and if you have a Dji Neo or you're currently doing your research on getting one, you'll have probably noticed there's one main thing that people complain about with this little drone, and that's the fact that the camera quality is a little bit lacking. That's not surprising because, to be fair to this drone, it's only 135 grams, it's very lightweight, the camera's tiny, it's optical stabilization on the roll axis on your camera. All of that adds up to your camera quality being a little bit lacking. But not to worry, because in this video I'm going to run you through my top 5 tips on how you can optimize the videos coming from this drone, what settings to use, and so on. So without further ado, let's get straight onto it and get onto tip number 1. Okay, so the first tip is mostly to do with auto settings. Now, the Neo's got a bit of a tendency to overexpose when you're in auto settings and pretty much blow out your highlights, the sky, reflections. You can actually see the reflections of the sun in this white windmill. It pretty much is completely blown out. You can't see any of the details in those wooden slats. So to mitigate that, what I do in conditions like this where it's extremely bright and your dynamic range is very wide is to reduce your EV down to -0.3 or -0.7. And as you can see, just bring it down to 0.7, drags down your exposure enough to bring out the details in those slats, and you've preserved your highlights, and you can always bring your shadows up in post-processing. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is eventually you want to switch into Pro mode for your camera settings, which gives you more flexibility and more control over the way you actually film. To do that, click on the little camera symbol at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and that'll switch from auto to Pro mode and bring up your camera settings. You can then choose your shutter speed and your ISO. Now, my tip here is to use a shutter speed between 1/60 and 1/120. I wouldn't go too high on your shutter speed because at high shutter speeds, fast movements with the drone can introduce like a weird strobe type effect and look a bit unsightly. So keep it around about there. Use a filter if you have to. So I've got an ND16 fitted at the moment. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. 1/60, ISO 100 is pretty much bringing up the right exposure at the moment, which is absolutely spot on. And I'm quite happy with that and happy to film with it. If you're at 1/60 and you want to increase your exposure a tiny bit, you could do that by using your ISO settings. One key point at this stage is keep your ISO as low as possible, as close to 100 as you can, to reduce the amount of noise that's introduced by the Neo, because the Neo does produce quite a bit of noise, and that can make your footage look quite unprofessional. So keep your ISO very, very low. It's a key takeaway from this point. Okay, my next tip is to use HDR on the Neo, because you might not know this, but the Neo can take footage in HDR mode. Like most DJI drones, in order to film in HDR mode, you need to be in auto mode for your camera settings. In this case, I do want to be in Pro mode, but what I can do is set my ISO to auto, and that'll then automatically turn HDR mode on. And just to demonstrate what that does for you, so I'm currently 1/60, ISO 200. Look what happens when I turn auto ISO on. So magically, all my shadows have suddenly been brought up. My highlights have been brought down a little bit washy, and it might not be for everyone. So it's not the perfect mode to use, but in some situations, depending on your highlights and your dynamic range that you're filming in, this might be the mode to go for, and it might be a look that you prefer over non-HDR look. ISO is now at 370. Now, just to show that if I manually choose ISO 400, there you go, that's ISO 400, and then with auto on, so it's not just raising exposure or reducing it, it's actually giving you a form of HDR. But to take this one step further, one of the problems with shooting in auto mode is that for most of us, the reason we avoid auto mode is because your exposure is going to change as you move around. And in this case, obviously my ISO is at 440. As I move around this, you can see that my ISO is going to start to move a little bit. ISO 400, it's reducing, 360. 370, And as I start to shoot into the sun, it's really coming down. Yeah, it's 2:30 now. To get around this, what you can do is you can fix your exposure by using auto exposure lock, but still have that HDR mode. So in my case, I've got auto exposure lock set to a button, the C2 button, and I click that, and I've now fixed my auto exposure. I've still got HDR, but as I'm moving around, as you can see, so I'm currently at 390. That exposure is not going to change at all, and it's going to give you a slightly more professional sort of look. My fourth tip is to use filters, because the Dji Neo doesn't have a variable aperture. That means that the only way you can adjust the light going through to your sensor is by adjusting your shutter speed and ISO. So by using a filter, you can control that light and keep your shutter speed down to about 1/60 to 1/120 and avoid it from going too high. Like I said previously, it doesn't matter if you're slightly above 1/60 with a little drone like this. Wouldn't get too hung up about the 180 rule, but I'd just avoid going particularly high, like 1/1000 can just look a bit too stuttery and a bit weird. So it brings me on to my giveaway, which is a set of Bright Day ND filters by Freewell. These are the NDPL versions, which I've been using. They work very well, and I can highly recommend them. To win one of these, all you've got to do is leave your guess in the comments below on how many Dji Neos I've gone through at this point, including this one, because as you know, I've crashed a lot of these, and that means I've bought a number of them. So how many Dji Neos have I owned up until this point, including the one I'm flying now? The closing date for this competition is the 31st of December, so if you're watching this video afterwards, please don't enter. I'll then choose a random winner from the correct answers, and I'll send you a set of your filters. So my fifth point is nothing to do with the Dji Neo in particular, or any drone in fact. It's really to do with natural light and understanding natural light. When you watch release videos of drones and that footage looks absolutely epic, and then sometimes you wonder, why does mine look nothing like it? It's simply that the people who produce those videos really understand how to use natural light, what time of day to take it. As you can see, today's video, the lights constantly change. I've constantly had to change my settings. So how to use that natural light, how to obscure it, how to slightly block it, what time of day you take it, what kind of cloud coverage you use, all of those factors combined can really bring the best out of the footage you're going to take with any drone, even if it's quite limited in its capability, like the Neo. So that's my last point. It's definitely worth studying that a little bit and learning about lights to give you the best chance of producing great footage with your drone. So that brings me on to the end of this video, and I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. As usual, stay safe, happy flying, hope the weather gets nicer, and until next time, I'll see you very soon. Bye bye.